This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. This season, we're partnering with Democracy Exchange, Canada's Democracy Summit, taking place April 16th to 18th in downtown Toronto. The summit tackles today's most urgent civic issues over 3 days of programming, including inspiring speakers, thought-provoking expert panels, and hands-on workshops. As a Progress Canada listener, you can save 20% off registration by using this code, Lightbulb at DXC26. Visit democracyexchange.org to register today. Today we're joined by the 20th Premier of Ontario, David Peterson. Thanks so much for joining me.
This is my idea of fun on a wintry afternoon.
All right, so I want to take us back to 1985, which is, of course, before my birth, but you were there.
You were, yeah. Go ahead. Tell everybody you weren't alive then.
So I want to talk about that year in particular, because at the time when you got elected, when you became premier, you were the only Liberal premier in the country, which is something that has not happened very often. It is something that is the case right now as well. You had actually not been alive yourself when the party you replaced had formed government, and this had, the PCs had been the government for much of your lifetime. So you were rebuilding a Liberal Party that had just been in the wilderness for decades and decades. So I want to start off with, how the heck did you rebuild the Liberal brand given that context?
Look, Teresa, I've got to take you back, because it didn't all start in 1985. That was a result of a lot of history and a lot of work. But I was elected originally in 1975. And don't forget, that was an election that Bob Nixon was kind of supposed to win. And the Liberal Party historically, and prior to that, had been really a very conservative party. It was a rural rump. It occupied a lot of seats in southwestern Ontario. And what happened was the Liberal Party was looking for an urban breakthrough in 75. And again, I'm 10 years before you, the question you asked. And they didn't get it. And the only urban breakthrough that the party had was in London, Ontario. We won 3 seats, but didn't win any more in Toronto. Then Bob resigned and Stuart Smith came in. And I ran in that leadership. It was premature. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I had a very steep learning curve. And one of the things Stuart did, Stuart was a very bright guy and a great speaker, and he was sort of seen as a shadow of Pierre Trudeau, but he was a progressive, and he started dragging the party into more progressive stances on things to appeal more to an urban base. Stuart ran in 77 and lost. He ran in 81 as leader and lost. Then I became leader in 1982. Now that's where that modern phase started. And when I ran in 1982, the second time I'd run for leader, I knew the party reasonably well. I had traveled virtually the entire province from top to bottom and been in every little town and met a lot of the important people that make Ontario go, whether it's the mayors or the hospital administrators or the environmentalists or the First Nations chiefs or whatever, labor people, business people. And I had a kind of a handle on what we had to do, but it was like taking over a bankrupt company. We had very little in the bank. We didn't have any money in the bank. That's the starter. Number two, we didn't have any sort of policies that were sort of particularly attractive. We didn't have the research unit we needed. We had some very good caucus people, and we had a deep history, but we weren't identified with any of the issues of the day. And there was a sense that Bill Davis and the Conservatives would go on forever. They were like an old pair of shoes, they're kind of comfortable. And they weren't a horrible government. but they lost touch along the way. So we set out having to build everything in a very, very, very disciplined way. And I had to construct this brick by brick, body by body, person by person. I traveled the province. I went to every riding, and some places there weren't liberal organizations. We had to find one person to take over and help out. I remember I've used this example before, but it's true. Yeah, I went to Smith Falls, and they had a big liberal rally, and two people showed up. And I said, but you have to give it all both barrels, right? And I went back next year, and four people showed up. I say, well, look, that's double. That's a huge improvement. Depends on how you view it, right? But that's the
Exactly.
kind of building we had to do, and find candidates and people that were interested. I had 3 years to do it. Build a campaign team under Ross McGregor that was fabulous. And don't forget, we didn't have the resources of the Conservatives. And we had to build the research unit under Tom Zizes and Phil DeWan. And we built the best research unit as good as anybody had ever seen at Queen's Park. And we were able to compete in the House. And we had facts that we became the gold standard, where the press would come to us and say, what about this? What about that? And we had to be totally credible, and I had to improve my performance. There was lots of things I had to learn. And I had to familiarize myself with every issue in the province. Well, I did. I set about doing that. And then by the time the election was called, and if you want to talk about that, we had a lot of luck. We were 100% ready to go. And when we hit the ground running, and we never stopped from the beginning to the end. And so it was all carefully thought out, carefully planned, and a highly disciplined campaign. We were running against, only now I realize actually we were running against impossible odds, but we won anyway. Now, we had some luck along the way. The Conservatives changed leaders and other things, but we were just ready to go.
I want to talk about a little bit the Tory juggernaut that you were going up against, because again, this is a multi-decade machine that just kept winning elections, and there's always the sense in politics like, oh, eventually the government will defeat itself. Well, that government didn't do that for at least 6 cycles, I think it was. And you run into this campaign, and instead of allowing the Tories to really campaign on that deep experience, you kind of flipped the script on it and said, actually, that makes them really out of touch in this modern Ontario that has, risen up around their government. Can you talk about, and I think this is really relevant today as well in Ontario politics, but how important it was to your victory to reject this sort of nostalgia about what Ontario had been and embrace the future as, an era of inclusive opportunity for everybody?
Well, you asked the right question, because I think we understood something the Conservatives did not. It was like a bunch of old sort of white men running the province out of the back of the Albany Club, which, for those who don't know, is a Conservative club, or they had these breakfast meetings at the Park Plaza, and they controlled everything, including every piece of patronage. Do you know that, for example, under them, you couldn't get a job in a liquor store unless you went through the local Conservative member of Parliament? And they didn't understand the aspirations of women. Feminism was coming alive, and women wanted to be part of this. And as well as cultural communities. There's an awful lot of Canadians, the new Canadians particularly, that had been excluded from the halls of power before. And we understood in our DNA the changes, the cultural, the demographic changes that were going on in the province. And I really do think not every political party is in tune with the electorate all the time. But we were pretty much in tune with the electorate and a changing world. In my hometown of London, Ontario, which used to be the most conservative town in Canada, it was famous for the number of millionaires they had, more millionaires per capita than any other city in Toronto, in Canada. But the power was shifting not from the London Club, where all the rich guys hung out, to the Marconi Club and the Hungarian Club and the other groups around town. And I understood that. And that became my political base. It wasn't the rich guys that we were there to speak for. We were there to speak for the people without power. And we were able to articulate that in a way. Now, look, there were other things going on, Teresa, that are very important. There was the separate school issue, and the change of leadership. You want to talk about we can, when the Tories went from Bill Davis, who's a pretty wily dude, and he moved with the times. He moved around, and he brought in separate school funding and totally shook his party up after having denied that policy before. But the biggest single change, in my opinion, was 1984 when Brian Mulroney won the national leadership with a stunning majority. And that wiped out all the Liberal parties in Canada. There were no Liberals left. And I knew in my heart and in my mind that change was afoot. And I knew we were in the right position to take advantage of that because, historically, there's been one party in Ottawa and another one in Toronto. So we had some luck, but I think preparation met opportunity here to give us the chance we had.
You mentioned the patronage piece, and I only know that fact about the LCBO from working with folks who you've worked with, of course, but most people don't know that fact, that you just really couldn't get a political appointment unless you were part of, the big blue machine. And it gets to the point, during 40 plus years of government where people start to expect that kind of behavior, that level of corruption or just self-dealing is just the political process. And they just kind of paint everybody in politics that way. But you came in on a promise to end polls, patronage, and privilege, which I just, like the alliterative factor of that. But
very well said.
It's actually a really hard sell when people expect that from all politicians to come in and say, actually, we're going to end politics as usual and do it differently. Can you talk a little bit about tackling that head on and giving voters sort of the permission to see something else as possible?
And, I didn't even understand the full extent of this when I got elected, but every judge, they had to be virtually a conservative. The QCs, for example, a QC for a lawyer is supposed to designate some kind of expertise at the bar. They were handing them out to every Tory mortgage broker in town, just as a form of patronage, because there was some prestige to it, presumably. We got rid of all that stuff and got rid of the QCs, and we brought in the Order of Ontario, which is based on merit to this day. It's a highly prestigious order based on merit and contributions to your communities. But the jobs in the liquor store, because it was a different story. And I didn't even kind of campaign on this, but I was sitting in my office one day and somebody brought in a huge stack of orders in council for me to sign. And I said, what's this for? And said, this is for all the jobs in the liquor store. If you wanted a job in the liquor store in those days, you would go to the local member of parliament, mostly a conservative, but if it was the defeated candidate, and he or she would would recommend you. Just like if you wanted a lease for a liquor store, they'd only lease the liquor stores to their buddies and their developer buddies, to give them steady income to finance the real estate projects. Well, I said, what is this for? And they said, it's for jobs in the liquor store. I said, I'm not doing this. And I didn't even realize it was happening. And I said, we're not doing this. We're going to change it. Well, how do normal people get jobs? They go to Manpower, they apply for a job, they apply on the merits, and we're going to do this. So I announced this, and then I remember We changed all this, but what had happened was all the, unbeknownst to us, unbeknownst to me, all the managers of the liquor stores who did the hiring were conservatives. So we stopped the jobs coming from Order and Council from the cabinet. We said we'll hire on the local basis. You'll go to Manpower and go to the manager of the liquor store. And the liquor store guys were all kept hiring conservatives. And so I remember Jim Bradley coming to me and said, Peterson, you were so stupid. You turned over all this patronage to the conservative, you left it in the conservatives' hands. And I said, Jim, it'll take maybe a generation to clean this system up because it's so inbred now. The way that it goes back to the question you raised with me, it was inbred. But we've changed that now, and at the time changes these things. And it was clearly the right thing to do, as it was to get rid of QCs, until Doug Ford brought them back, to establish meritocracy. Teresa, this world, when you believe as you do and I do, that our job is to provide opportunity, that's opportunity irrespective of political affiliation, just irrespective of sex or religion or color. And that was the fight. And those are just examples of the kinds of things that we ran on and we implemented and we fought for.
I think it's interesting because there's the partisan lens to this, of course, that it's all Tories and you don't want, to the victor goes the spoils of everything that happens in government, which is supposed to serve the public. But there's another element to it. And I remember years ago, Jerry Phillips, who you know well, Jerry Phillips had said to us in a room once, this is actually when I was working for Deb Matthews, he had said to us as staffers, look for the people who don't know how to access government. And there's an enormous part of this conversation that's part of that, which is, Ontario was diversifying as a province. There's a lot of newcomers who maybe don't know how to access some of these jobs even. So it's not even just the partisan question. It's is this open to all Ontarians? Is everybody able to know that these jobs exist and apply for them? How important was that?
Jerry said it beautifully, and there's nobody on earth, but Jerry was a very important cabinet minister for me, as well as for Dalton and others. But nobody had a bigger heart than Jerry, and nobody understood this, because Jerry was very successful. He made it all on his own. He's from London, Ontario. You know that he was actually in high school ahead of me.
So it's that London connection.
Yeah, that's that London connection. I don't want to be partisan or small-minded about this. But he's right. And a lot of people, I used to say, we don't speak for the powerful. The big unions speak for themselves. Big money speaks with far too loud a voice in this world. Business speaks with too loud a voice. We have to speak for the people that don't have power. And we have to teach them how to take advantage of the opportunities for their children and for themselves. And that was who we represented. That was who I tried to speak for.
So that actually leads me very nicely into our next question, which is always ideal. I want to talk about the framing of the 1985 campaign because, as a writer, as a communications person, I'm all about the framing and how you position a campaign. But I think the way you position that campaign is really helpful for Liberal politicians and supporters just kind of across the board. So this is how it was said in one of I think this was your nominating speech as a candidate ahead of the 1985 election. You said, the Ontario Liberal Party is the only party that is not in the back pocket of any special interest group, not the bank presidents or the union bosses. And then you went on to say, it doesn't owe anything to anyone other than you, the voters who put us into office. Why do you think that was such an effective message, both in terms of the contrast that obviously drew with the Conservatives and the NDP, but also just, bringing to mind a different type of politics that people hadn't seen at the time?
I think it resonated at the time. Why it did, Teresa, you're probably a better analyst than I am of that, but that's still a message that resonates today. You look at the number of, I look at today the disparities between the rich and the poor, I look at the people that cannot break out of these cycles of poverty, that I look at. I'm not sure if the world is getting fair. In some ways, perhaps it's getting fair, but I see many examples of people that just need a hand up at certain times. And that's the job of government, to help those people and to identify them, and whether it's they need a single mom who needs a little childcare, or somebody that needs an education, or someone that a kid that needs a hockey stick, you know, that's our job. And never fall victim to the loud voices that just want to take more out of this society. Our job, even though I believe as liberals, half of the time as being premier, you have to worry about creating wealth, because you can't just spend money you don't have. That's unfair, and loading these debts onto the next generation. But the other half is distributing fairly what we have and providing opportunity.
So something I want to talk about, which I've been very impressed about and learning more and more about your government, is this idea that it was a government that raised expectations. So, on the hustings, actually, this was just before the 1985 election. So this was actually in the legislature. You had said to all the other fellow MPPs that we needed to stop telling people to expect less. And I think it's a really interesting thing for a politician to say, because we see a lot of excuses get made about, why we can't progress on that or move forward on that. And your government was an extremely ambitious government. You had a clear idea of what you wanted to achieve. You understood how the world was changing, and you wanted to bridge the gap between where society was in 1985 and where it was going to be in, say, 2000. This is something I've seen a lot in studying your government, is you were really, really focused on the new millennium, which is, at the time, this was 15 years in the future. Most governments think in 4-year terms. You were very, very focused on the long term. And I really think, as politicians, as staffers, we need to be thinking more in eras as opposed to, hey, what's going to get us elected in the next round? And I think your government really, really espoused that. So how important was it to instill that sense of possibility for voters? Because it seemed, when you get used to a 40-year government, you don't really have a lot of dreams about what's possible. And I think you allowed Ontarians to dream again a bit.
I hope that's the case, and I think we did a little bit. But I'd use something we did in terms of our economic strategy to answer your question. We assembled something that's never been done before in parliamentary, called the Premier's Council on Competitiveness. And I asked a bunch of people to join this, and they were labor leaders, business leaders, academics, people who could make a contribution. They didn't have to agree with everything we said. They didn't have to vote for us, but we wanted the best wisdom we could possibly find. And we concocted out of this a report and a strategy for the Ontario economy called Competing in the New Global Economy. And this was different from the continental views that Mulroney had, just putting all our eggs in the US basket. And you can see where that's getting us today. And we said, all right, we have to be technology based. We have to lead the world. We have to master the technology, and we have to compete globally, and we have to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers. Teresa, it's uncanny how the debate today in this country, after trying trade and being so vulnerable and facing what we're facing, it's uncanny how those issues are identical to the things we discussed then. And I suspect, and it's very pathetic in life and in politics to say I told you so. But if you look back to what we were espousing then, if we had taken that view, then the view we did, then I think Canada would be in a very different position than it was today. So we were prescient. And when I talk about that, and it was how we had to concentrate on skills, on people, technology, and we had to take different approaches. We put $1 billion into this. We created centers of excellence, what are still existing. We created programs to encourage entrepreneurialism and investment, like creating a teacher's superannuation fund, a teacher's pension fund to invest in Ontario businesses. We created for example, the Film Development Corporation to build the film industry here. And all of these things are still going, and they're part of a prosperous Ontario, which is very much under assault. And you can see we're still arguing about the old things in this province rather than the new things and where we're going. So we need some far-sighted leadership, and it's not easy to communicate through all of this, but we tried.
I think your point about, not saying I told you so is an interesting one in
Tempting.
politics,
It's
because
very tempting. Very tempting.
it's so tempting, and it's one of those things that you really can't win if you are right about these sort of forecasting things, because if you are right, something's gone wrong, and that doesn't feel great. And if you're wrong, well, then you're wrong. There's that piece to it. But I do want to, I wasn't planning to talk about this, but I do want to touch on the free trade agreement stuff in the 1980s, because you were opposed to it, not in principle, but you wanted to have a better deal. You had 6 requirements that you wanted to see in the free trade deal, and then afterwards as well. Why were you so opposed to being so tied to the US, and what lessons should we perhaps learn about what has happened over the last 30 years?
Well, Teresa, one of the things you have to understand, very few people do, what an industrial powerhouse Ontario is. When I was there, if Ontario had been a separate country, it would have been the 11th largest country in the world in terms of its GDP. And you realize that a lot of our economy was foreign owned. You realize that a lot of our manufacturing was, and you realize that we had to take advantage of the natural advantages we have. One of those was Niagara Falls, a relatively cheap power, and we were well centered geographically. And frankly, we had been the beneficiaries of the national policy going back right to John A. Macdonald. And we had to maintain that manufacturing base. And in this modern world, the only way you can maintain that is by technological excellence. And your education system ties right into this. And this had to be your focus. Our focus should not have been selling cheaper wood or cheaper gold, even though that's the important part of our economy. And there was a natural competition with the resource-based parts of the Canadian economy. So I had also, prior to being in politics, had traveled the world. I was involved in businesses that were working globally, and I could see what was happening, and I had an idea of what was happening in China and Japan and what other people were doing. And I believed very strongly we couldn't just dig things out of the ground or cut it down and export it. We had to use our brains. Some of the great leaders of the world, the Lee Kuan Yews out of Singapore and others, were doing, and people in Taiwan, were doing very, very interesting things with their brains. So I took the view that that's where we had to put our feet clearly facing the future, not the past. And I think those discussions are ongoing today. You listen to Mark Carney, honest to God, I think I sometimes think he's reading my old speeches. And if we'd taken a different road 30 years ago, even at 5% incremental increase a year, we'd be in a very different place than we are when we're 80% of our exports going to the States. The States just attracted everything like a magnet, created some short-term prosperity, but nobody on earth predicted someone like Donald Trump would come along and totally upend every basis of our prosperity and threaten our existence as a country. I mean, even in my most dismal moments, I had never anticipated anything like this, but it's a fact, and it's a serious threat to our sovereignty and our economic independence.
I think it's very interesting because I'm I'm a political and history nerd, so I know that John Diefenbaker had actually talked a lot about the danger in the 1960s of Canada being an economy of extraction, and I think he argued a little bit for this knowledge economy, which you were talking about, and your government in particular, you raise post-secondary funding by 8%, which is an enormous number that I don't think has happened again since then. But you saw the value in educating people so that we could lead in the type of economy that you were talking about. So, you've talked a little bit about the coalition of people that you built, but one thing we didn't really touch on yet was the importance of youth in your government. I've never seen a government in Ontario focus so much on young people. And I suspect a lot of that was your focus on the economy and building the economy of the future. But you were just really, really focused on making sure that young people could get ahead in life. There was a lot of youth unemployment at the time. There's a lot now. We're, nearing around 20% youth unemployment in Ontario. Why were young people such a focus for you at the time, and how should we make them a focus again in these modern times?
Well, I was reasonably young at the time, Tree. So whether
I was going to say, you're only at the time when you got elected, you're about a year older than I am now.
Yeah, well, you're a baby, and we were both babies. But I'm a dad. And I've got grandkids now, and I just apart from being trite and saying they're the future, which they obviously are, the things that they have to deal with are so different. I want you to remember when we were elected in 1985, we promised a job for every young person in the province, and we delivered on it. Can you imagine? That's a pretty ambitious project. Now, the economy was a reasonably good state. It was absorbing a lot of people at the time. But there's nothing better than a kid, my kid, your kid, my grandkids, than having a little job when they learn about discipline. They learn all the things you have to learn about life and start gaining confidence. And then educating them properly in relevant modern skills. You mentioned something else, Teresa, that troubles me a great deal. There's been not just freezes, but virtually cutting back of post-secondary education. And they have not allowed fee increases, which they should, because the universities, a lot of them have a lot of money to help people and with bursaries and economic help. But we have to have a competitive post-secondary education. We have to build the leadership. We have to have the business leaders. We have to have the scientific leaders. And if other people are just soaking them up, and even the United States has gone into a sort of almost a regression in these matters. And you look what China's doing. Look, the Chinese universities are starting to take over as the best. We have some very, very, very tough competition. And if we don't compete and win, we're going to be at the end of the tail of the donkey.
We've just talked about the importance of education, but every successful Liberal campaign I've seen has focused on three things: education, healthcare, and jobs in the economy. I think we've really focused in these opposition years now on healthcare, primarily because of the doctor shortage and things like that, and a little bit of education because of the cuts we've seen in that sector. But we seem to be forgetting about that jobs narrative, about that economic well-being narrative. Why do you think your team, when you ran for office and you focused on those three things largely, why do you think that was so successful? And why does that seem to be what drives success in every winning Liberal campaign? Like, it really does seem to be having those three prongs to it.
Yeah, I think there's, I never know for sure why people win elections. Is it just talking about the issue? Because people talk about healthcare and they lose. And people talk about, education and they can lose, or even the economy. It's something to do with this vague concept called leadership, the ability to reach through. Timing matters. Look at Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau was elected with a lot of magic, and he was going to bring something new and to this country, and he did. But in retrospect, they're seeing that he did not concentrate or lost focus on things that are important, i.e., the productivity in this country and building a strong economic base. It's hard work, it's daily work. Now, Mark Carney has sort of changed that formula a bit, and he's seen as one that's really tilting on the economy. But he has to, because he's facing threats that Trudeau never faced before. So there's something about being the person for the moment. And the person who's the right leader in 1980 would be maybe different than the person in 1990. And sometimes you just get lucky with the right person that resonates and that the opposition opens up some holes to you. But I think there's a wonderful opportunity in this province to go forward with a very positive agenda on the economy, of where we have to be, where your kids fit into this. And you've got to manage the healthcare system well. Don't forget the two biggest expenditure are health and education in the province. And if you don't get those right, if you can't run them right, you're going to get thrown out eventually.
I think your success, yes, you focus on those three issues, but I think one thing that was very important was actually offering a real alternative, as opposed to just saying, hey, we don't have enough of this, talking about all the deficits in service areas, which is what opposition parties, are kind of paid the big bucks to do. But at the end of the day, you have to give an alternative vision. And I think the other piece is, I think Liberals tend to win when you tie everything back to jobs, the economy, economic well-being. So we can talk about healthcare, but we need good healthcare systems so people are healthy and can go to work and do all those things. You were talking about, young people and education and what that meant for the future of the economy. I think that piece of tying it back seems to be a really crucial piece. And I don't know that as a party, we've really done that in the last few election cycles. Even when Kathleen Wynne won her surprise majority, there was a lot of focus on the minimum wage. It came back to making sure people had the material needs they needed to succeed. How important is that to the liberal viewpoint of equality of opportunity and really focusing on opportunity being our driving force as a party?
Well, you see, that's where you come into this, Teresa, that people like you, experts in communication, there's two things you have to get. In politics, you have to get the substance right. Substance is always the most important thing. What's the smart thing to do? What's the right thing to do for the economy? Then you say, well, how do you communicate that? So you're going to watch in the next little while people running for leader of the Liberal Party. They're going to articulate their views in these things. Then smart people, are you going to run? You should run.
God, no.
Well, if you're not going to run, then you figure out who you help and how you persuade people, because politics is about persuading people, and how you put it in terms that they understand. And you look at some of the great communicators, and you can be good at something and bad at three other things and still lose. There's no one thing. There is this magic called leadership. When we get somehow connect with people, and in the modern world, people look at you on television, they feel they know you, and they can penetrate through your smiles, the things you say, the things you do. There's so much scrutiny. So you have to sort of be fairly authentic about this stuff and demonstrate some competence.
So I want to flash forward a little bit now to, sort of 1987. So again, at the start of this conversation, we were talking about how you were the only Liberal premier across the province. Then you win this massive majority, the biggest in Ontario history. Then all of a sudden, we start to see that every government east of Quebec and Ontario is suddenly Liberal. I want to talk about that a little bit, how we went from this reality where there was no Liberal governments anywhere, and suddenly there's a whole rash of them. And I know you had a bit of a role to play in that in terms of your mentorship. It's Frank McKenna's birthday today, and I know you were very close together as premiers and also after that fact. How How did the Liberal brand rebound so quickly in the late 1980s?
Well, there's a number of factors here. Um, they all call it the Underhill curve, right? Frank Underhill was a famous political scientist, and he observed that, at least in Ontario, often you have a provincial government of one stripe and a federal government of the other stripe. And for some unarticulated reason, they theoretically keep each other honest. It doesn't really, in fact, work like that, but people tend to think that. So I'm going back to a point I made earlier. When Mulroney won, I knew we had a much better chance because the conditions were right for a credible Liberal government in Ontario. But after I was elected, and then Robert Bourassa came along, and this was a great relief on the country because now we had a non-separatist government. So that played into all this discussion we're having with the national unity questions that I was deeply and maybe too deeply involved in. Then Frank McKenna, who is one of my dearest friends on earth, was elected in New Brunswick, and he was a wonderful premier. And then Joe Giz and other people in the East, and it was quite a change. But then things change back, and then they go the other way, and then you get a Liberal in Ottawa or Conservative in Ottawa, and the Liberals come back in the provinces. So these are natural swings, and of course, part of a premier's job is to deal with the intergovernmental relationships and try to keep this country intact, and that's something that I had pretty strong views on.
Well, I think on that piece too, just because you were all Liberals didn't mean you agreed on everything, of course. You obviously had some disagreements with some folks in terms of the constitutional reforms that were taking place. Famously, you went to Newfoundland to argue for constitutional reforms and didn't go well in the end. But
I was very aligned with Bourassa and with Brian Mulroney. Frank had originally had some reservations, but he came on side. Every premier in the country came on side except Clyde Wells. Clyde Wells changed his view. He originally had been supported by Brian Peckford and the Conservatives. Then Clyde, in one of the most short-sighted acts of Canadian leadership ever, withdrew the leadership and destroyed Meech Lake. If Meech Lake had gone through, it is my profound belief that this country would not have gone through the referendum it did and almost lose itself, gone through these years of destabilization over the separatist issues. And here we are now, this year, probably facing election in Quebec, when the polls are the separatists are going to win with another in a majority. And you look at the facts, and you look at something that could have been prevented with a little generosity of spirit and a little understanding. And it wasn't anything to do with Clyde being a Liberal or a Conservative. He was just wrong. And Conservatives, I know, think he was wrong. Liberals think he was wrong. And I think history shows he was extraordinarily self-serving and narrow about this. You're right. I went to Newfoundland, spoke to the legislature, but so did Brian, so did Grant Devine, so did Frank McKenna, a bunch of us who passionately believed that we had an opportunity to make this country whole once and for all. And we understood the pressures, enormous pressures from the West. The Reform Party was starting then. Stephen Harper was and then in opposition, yelling about it. The separatists under Parizeau were hounding Robert Bourassa daily. The people that wanted destruction in this country, but the people that could see ahead, and Mulroney was part of that. And we all were, to try to make this country whole. Now, it collapsed, and Clyde used the excuse of Mulroney saying some inappropriate things in a particular press conference saying he rolled the dice, but it was just extraordinarily small-minded of Clyde, and I think, and he was a liberal, and frankly, he used to be a friend, but I think his mistake is in the category of inexcusable. And so I feel very strongly about this. Other people have different views. I respect that.
Given we're about to enter a similar reality now, you mentioned the Quebec election, and if the Separatist Party wins, it's going to be a very big challenge for them not to put a referendum on the table. There's talk about this. There's talk about this in Alberta, of course, as well. We don't currently have constitutional reforms conversations happening right now, which I think changes the temperature a little bit. What is your advice to Carney and other people who want to hold the country together? He seems to be taking more of an economic tack to dealing with these issues. What's your advice as somebody who's been in those trenches and gone through these struggles? What's the advice for, these discussions in this era?
Well, two things. The threats facing this country today are so different than the ones that faced us in the past. It's very hard to draw a parallel. Who would have thought there'd be a crazy man in the White House who's bent on, if not his own destruction, maybe other people's destruction? I mean, it's the things you just pick up the newspaper today and you read stuff that are so beyond the pale, it's unbelievable. Now, number two, I think we're lucky, and I'm not being partisan about this, but to have Mark Carney, if you put out an application for this job of prime minister, don't ask me how, but he ended up, we're lucky to have him. He's the right guy at the right time. And I think he has shown patience, forbearance, and understanding, deep judgment. And I think he's doing as well as anybody can possibly do. I don't say that in a partisan way. I say that in someone who cares passionately about his country. And he's taking a different approach. It's a very economic based. He's not doing a values based government like Trudeau did. But that being said, he's doing the things that have to be done. This issue of dealing with Alberta is tough. And I dealt with them then, but we had some people that really stood up for the country at the right time. Even Bill Vander Zalm, and who was not your average politician, and Don Getty, who stood up for Meech Lake only not because they weren't under pressure, they were. They stood up because they honestly believed it was in the interest of a united Canada. And so did Barrasso, who was under pressure. In the interest of a united Canada, we're better off united than apart. So it's tough right now. And you see, on one hand, Danielle Smith is settling down a little bit. She's very difficult. And she's skirting on the edges with a lot of things that I think are very, very dangerous. And whether she's a real Canadian or whether she's just a manipulator or just wants to play the game, I'm not exactly sure, but it's difficult. I think Carney is managing that situation well. Quebec, I don't know. I think I see the massive changes in Quebec with the Premier leaving and the Liberal Party having a big void. The PQ seeming to be doing very well. They have a compelling and dangerous narrative. And all I know, you've got to deal with all of these things. The biggest single job of the Prime Minister is to keep the country together. I honestly believe that the Premier of Ontario's job, as the second most important political job in the country, was to keep an axis with Quebec City, Ottawa, and Toronto to keep this country together. We are so much better together, and it takes a little sacrifice occasionally and a lot of understanding and reaching out. So this is not a one-person job. This is many people have to be involved, including ultimately all the population. If people don't believe we're better off as Canadians than we are as Saskatchewanians or Manitobians or New Brunswickers, then this country's going to fall apart, and we will regret that to our dying days.
I want to bring it back to partisanship now. So last year in Newfoundland, we had a Liberal premier, and in the Yukon, we had a Liberal premier, and they both lost their elections in 2025. So now that leaves Susan Holt, who's current premier of New Brunswick, as the only remaining Liberal premier in the country, which is obviously a reality you're very familiar with. I wanted to ask you why you think, perhaps beyond Underhill, why there has been such a downward trend in Liberal provincial fortunes across the country in recent years.
I don't know if I know why. Is it leadership? Is it circumstances? Is there a right-wing trend amongst the Western world? Some people would say there is. You look what's happening in England and France and Germany and the United States. Is there a new ethic building on dislike of others, of hatred, of being anti-immigrant? It's absolutely the antithesis of everything I believe in. I believe, Teresa, that good government is an extension of caring and love. And you bring those principles into look at helping others and as well as helping yourself. And why the Liberals, each provincial Liberal Party is different. And I always believed the Liberal Party of Ontario had to be different from the feds, not just a little brother or sister. It had to be independent, because at different times you're going to have different points of view. And each one has to fight their own battles. But there's a core of values that keep us together. That core of values is about things we've been talking about today: caring about other people, helping other people, using the power of the state to make sure everybody has opportunities, making sure we're creating economic opportunities for people, including people that have previously been excluded. There's lots of people on the outskirts of life that need to be brought in. That's where we care. That's what we have in common as Liberals. And I think that philosophy is, look, I've never heard a better one articulated, and we just have to get out and fight for it.
So in 1989, you weren't a terribly partisan premier, in my opinion. Some people are, some people aren't. I think you were pretty open to working with whoever. But back in 1989, you went to Harvard and the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and you gave a speech called In Defense of the L Word. And I love this speech. I've read a number of your speeches, but I really like this speech.
You're the only one that has, so thank you.
In it, you argued that liberalism is all about freedom and justice and best balances individual and societal needs. Do you think that's still true of the Liberal brand today?
Yes, I still think it is the value system that has stood the test of time, and people, even lots of nominal conservatives, come back to a more liberal point of view, like Mulrooney did. And Doug Ford, God bless him, is not burdened by ideology, so he's sort of kind of in there too. But I remember that speech. I went to speak at Harvard, and I've never been more intimidated in my life. In that room that I was speaking to at Harvard, John Kenneth Galbraith was there. Shirley Williams was there. Robert Reich was there. Some of the greatest names in U.S. politics were standing there, and they were sort of sure the liberal, some of the liberal wing of politics then. And I was making the case to all these people, because some people were arguing then that liberalism was dead. I'm glad you read that speech, and then you have to decide if it stands the test of time.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do want to bring up a few more points from it. So there's this conversation that's been happening in politics over the last decade or so, since essentially Trump coming on the political scene. And it's this idea of social justice being woke. And, we all have opinions about these word usages and stuff. But in that speech, you very passionately defended the idea of social justice. So I'm going to give you some quotes here. You said, "The choice between social justice and economic prosperity is a false dichotomy. Maximizing social justice requires us to pursue a high degree of prosperity. Freedom without social justice is only freedom for some." How should liberals make the case for inclusive progress today, just given the attack on this idea of social justice?
You've done your homework, and I wish you hadn't. These are hard questions, but I listened to those words again, and they still resonate with me. And then you're asking, why is that not the case? Why are we doing all this anti-wokey stuff? And what is wokeness anyway? Wokeness is, in its finest sense, is just a sensitivity to other people's differences, right? Pushed too far, some people get upset when you're pushing off the mainstream. And so I think there are lots of lessons in here for wokey liberals not to push their agendas too far and understand that society can only go so far at a time. But it doesn't minimize the idea that government should be about helping others, about finding the common good. And it's not just, government isn't just a referee for the biggest, roughest, toughest guys fighting in a ring and declaring a winner. It's got to make everybody a winner. And that's the job. And there are lots of winners in the world today, but there are more losers. That's the problem.
I'm going to give you another quote that I wasn't planning to give you, which is, you said this at the Achievements Employment Equity Awards in 1985. And this is the quote: "Some may feel threatened as we seek to include those who have been excluded. It is government's job to make clear how all benefit when all are encouraged to make full use of their potential." I love this quote because it really does sum up, modern liberalism in my mind. And a lot of the time when we talk about inclusion, we talk about the benefit to the person being included. But what I think is so important about that quote from you is that you're talking about the benefit to the rest of society. And I don't think we highlight that enough when we talk about these issues.
Teresa, this is the essence of caring about our neighbors. If my neighbor is happy and cuts their grass and picks up their garbage and isn't yelling and screaming and fighting with his wife every night and is a pleasant person to get along with, I have a happier life. I put that's in very sort of pedestrian terms, but if my neighbor is happy, I'm going to be happy. And if I don't walk down the street and see a whole bunch of homeless people who are making me feel uncomfortable or guilty because they don't have something, then I'm going to be happy. I really do believe that one's own personal happiness is very much related to the happiness of people around them, smaller groups and bigger groups. And I think if we can understand that, it allows us to be, shall we say, having a healthy ego as opposed to an unhealthy ego. There's nothing the matter with having a healthy ego, but a healthy ego is always in conjunction with other people's egos. Everybody doing well, and that's I think something we have to aspire to. It's almost religious, even though I'm not religious. There's a lot of truth in finding the common good.
So speaking of that, before we end off, I want to talk about the upcoming Ontario Liberal Party leadership race. So we've obviously had a number of these over the last few years.
Too many.
But you had said recently that if you were a younger man, you would go throw your hat in the ring. And I love that energy because it's like, well, why the hell not, right? Why not just run for this and see what you can put in the window and see who responds to it? what would your advice be to, there's a number of people right now thinking about running themselves. What's your advice to them as people looking at a party that's been in opposition for a number of years, is probably nearly as broken and broken as when you took over? What's your advice for them to take that rump and turn it into government?
I think it's the greatest piece of political real estate in the country. I think there's a tremendous opportunity. I think the barnacles are showing on the government of the day. I think people are looking for a new vision and idealism. Don't underestimate the power of idealism and the desire of people to want to make the world a better place. It's intertwined with hope. It's intertwined with what can I do to make the world a better place? And so I look at this, and then you, in practical terms, you look at the field. There are some really impressive members of the Ontario Liberal Party. I mean, whether 15 of them, I'm telling you, there's a bunch of people in there, and I know some of them, I don't know them all, but who are really, really impressive. And if we trade those people in front of the population, say, look, you've got some substance and some depth. Somebody's going to break through here and be able to coalesce the party, and then go and gather up people and recruit like-minded people. I think and it goes to some of the things you and I have been talking about. I was raised, and you were saying how young you are, and I admit it, you're young. But when I was raised under the influence of John Kennedy. And a lot of people have never heard of him. Lots of people, some Canadians haven't even heard of Pierre Trudeau. You know, there is a short memory in politics. But John Kennedy, when he was sworn in, said something that resonated with me and every other politician of my generation. And that was, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that typified the age. It was the age, it was the hippie time, it was the age of love, it was a different time. I have talked to some of the most important politicians in the world, like, for example, Bill Clinton. And I used to meet Clinton at when he was governor and I was premier. He was always on the stage because he was the smartest guy in the room. And I was always on the stage because I represented the biggest province. We got to know each other. And you'd sit up at night and have a drink and say, well, what got you into this business? Or Jimmy Blanchard, who was the governor of Michigan, was a great friend of Americans, Canadians, Frank McKenna, and others. It all goes back to that sentiment that resonated with all of us and said, there are bigger things in the world than just us. There are bigger things to try for and aspire to. And I think those sentiments are universal. And I think if we can unlock that today, there's so many problems that need to be solved. And if you can liberate that idealism, liberate that sense of, let's all pitch in and try to do something. Let's all not think we have to go and be investment bankers at Goldman Sachs. Let's make the world a better place. I'm telling you, it's a powerful sentiment.
I really appreciate that as a Pearsonian myself. I'm a big Pearson fan, but it's this idea of previous generations of a sense of duty that isn't just for leaders, it's for everybody. It's something where we should all feel a sense of contributing to society together and making sure those beside us are better off and those who come after us are better off. And I think, I had this feeling prior to COVID that we had lost that sense. And I had hoped that if we went through something really dramatic like COVID, that sense of duty would come back. And I think it did for a time. I think it has dissipated a little bit. I'm hoping that we can revive it, but I do think it requires leadership. There is one question I want to talk about, which is, we talk about leadership as like some kind of be all and end all, but at the end of the day, leaders aren't going to be perfect. You weren't perfect when you became leader. You're still not now. Delta McGuinty
Oh,
had a lot of
come
work to
on.
do.
Come on.
Kathleen Wynne had some work to do as well, right? I think we get the sense of, hey, we're going to get a messiah. They're going to come in and just solve all the problems. And that's just not how politics works. That's not how leadership works. What's your advice to the membership as they make this decision about who should lead us next and what their responsibilities are to help build a Liberal Party that can win and bring in a better government for people?
Well, fortunately, we have a core of some very, very fine people in the Liberal Party. And, what brings these young people? What attracted to you this when you were a kid? Why did you get involved in this business? You could have gone and been a doctor or a lawyer or something a little more prosaic, And what is it? It's something you care very much about your world. You know how to work with other people. You can try to help get the best out of others. You realize that collective action is more effective than individual action. Some people can come along and liberate this and articulate why people should get together. And don't be afraid to stick your neck out. I think if you ask me, you haven't, but I'll ask myself, then I'm going to answer the question. Why did what really drove your life? A couple of things. Serendipity. Nice things just came along in my life, and I took advantage of them. I didn't plan a hell of a lot. It just kind of happened. I didn't plan to meet Shelley. I met her and I married her 2.5 months later. The best thing I ever did. I didn't plan to get into politics, but I was talked into it and I did it. I wasn't planning on running leader. I wasn't planning on being premier. None of that stuff has happened, but it just, circumstances came along that just allowed me to take advantage of the situation. And I had a lot of luck doing that. But the other thing that I would say, I had one advantage that a lot of people don't have. I wasn't afraid of failure. And failure teaches you. I had my failures, I had my losses, I had the things that didn't work out well. But I wasn't afraid of that. And I didn't take that stuff personally. And so I would say to the young people you asked me to talk to, don't be afraid of failure. Stick your neck out, do what you believe in, and the worst that could happen, you lose and go back and do it again.
There you go. I think that is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I really enjoyed being with you, and you've really done your work, and it's a joy to talk to you, and you're reminding me of some of my misspent youth.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.